The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Dr. Malcolm Washington straightened his tie one last time. Today wasn't just any Monday, it was his first day as a professor at Westfield University. His fingers traced over the leather briefcase his father had given him when he earned his PhD. Inside were lecture notes he'd spent weeks perfecting. "You've earned this," he whispered to himself, a ritual that had carried him through many first days, from his childhood school in a struggling neighborhood to the hallowed halls of MIT. Malcolm had always stood out, first as the kid who fixed everybody's computers, then as the scholarship student who broke records, and now as the first black professor ever hired in Westfield's computer science department. His research on quantum computing algorithms had turned heads across the country. 3 universities had tried to recruit him, but Westfield's renowned research facilities had won him over. As he walked across campus, students hurried past with backpacks and coffee cups. The old brick buildings stood tall against the blue sky, their windows reflecting sunlight. Malcolm paused to take it all in. After years of hard work, he had finally arrived. "Welcome to Westfield, Dr. Washington," called out Dean Powell, a thin woman with silver-rimmed glasses who had championed his hiring. "The faculty meeting starts in 10 minutes. Perfect timing to introduce you to everyone." The department conference room buzzed with conversation that quickly died down when Malcolm entered. 12 faces turned to look at him, some smiling, others unreadable. Dean Powell guided him to an empty chair. "Everyone, this is Dr. Malcolm Washington, joining us from MIT. His work on quantum algorithms is groundbreaking, and we're extremely fortunate to have him." A round of polite applause followed. A few professors nodded in his direction. Others avoided eye contact altogether. "Thank you for the warm welcome," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I'm looking forward to working with all of you." Dr. Richard Harmon, the department chair, cleared his throat. A heavy-set man with thinning hair and thick glasses, he'd been at Westfield for 27 years. "Yes, well, welcome," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We have a full agenda today, so let's get started." Throughout the meeting, Malcolm offered thoughtful comments on curriculum changes and research priorities. Each time, Dr. Harmon would pause, blink slowly, then continue as if Malcolm hadn't spoken. When Professor Chen suggested something similar to Malcolm's earlier point, Harmon nodded enthusiastically. "Excellent insight, David. Let's explore that further." After the meeting, Malcolm chatted with a few friendly colleagues, including Professor Chen, who seemed embarrassed by what had happened. But most hurried away, suddenly busy with urgent matters. As days turned into weeks, a pattern emerged. Malcolm would arrive early to his office to find the cleaning staff hadn't come. His name was misspelled on the department website. His class was scheduled in the smallest lecture hall, despite having the largest enrollment numbers. "Computer glitch," the admin assistant explained with a shrug when he inquired about the room assignment. One afternoon, Malcolm rounded a corner and stumbled upon Harmon and 3 other senior professors deep in conversation. "Diversity quota," Harmon was saying. "The dean's office pushed this through without." He stopped abruptly when he noticed Malcolm. "Dr. Washington, just discussing the fall schedule," Harmon said too brightly. "We're all set for tomorrow's meeting, yes?" That night, Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, grading papers until his eyes burned. His phone buzzed with a text from his brother. "How's it going at the fancy university?" Malcolm stared at the message for a long time. He thought about their grandfather who had cleaned university buildings but never been allowed to take classes. He thought about his parents who had sacrificed everything for his education. "It's challenging," he finally replied, "but I've never backed down from a challenge." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and made a decision. He wouldn't let them break him. He would let his work speak for itself. Little did they know, Malcolm Washington had overcome far worse obstacles than a few cold shoulders and schedule glitches. This was just the beginning, and he was here to stay. 2 months into the fall semester, Malcolm settled into a routine. He arrived at his office before sunrise, treasuring the quiet hours when he could work without interruption. The morning light would gradually fill the small room, the smallest office in the department, tucked away in the basement corner, with pipes that clanked overhead and windows that faced a brick wall. He was erasing yesterday's equations from his whiteboard when his phone buzzed. It was an email from the department secretary. Class location changed effective immediately. Room 210 unavailable due to maintenance. Your class moved to Annex Building, Room A3. Malcolm frowned. The Annex was the oldest building on campus, a 10-minute walk from the main science complex. Most students didn't even know where it was. He glanced at his watch, 40 minutes until his lecture started. Barely enough time to email his students and relocate his materials. Just great, he muttered, quickly packing his demonstration equipment. This was the third time his classroom had been changed this semester. Somehow, no other professor seemed to have this problem. As he hurried across campus, arms full of equipment, he spotted Dr. Harmon strolling leisurely toward the faculty lounge with Professor Wilson. They were laughing about something. Neither acknowledged Malcolm as they passed, though he nodded politely. The Annex building smelled of old books and floor polish. Room A3 was half the size of his previous classroom, with creaky wooden chairs instead of modern desks. The projector hung from the ceiling by what looked like duct tape. Malcolm set up his equipment, wondering how he'd fit his 60 students into a room designed for 30. By the time class started, students were sitting in the aisles, some perched on the windowsills. Many looked annoyed, others confused. "Sorry about the last-minute room change," Malcolm said, trying to sound upbeat. "Let's make the best of it. Today we're exploring quantum entanglement." Despite the cramped conditions, the lecture went well. His students were bright and engaged, asking thoughtful questions. Teaching was his refuge, the place where his knowledge and passion spoke for themselves. After class, a student named Tyler lingered. "Dr. Washington, I wanted to ask about joining your research team next semester." "I'd be happy to talk about that. My office hours are." "Actually," Tyler interrupted, looking uncomfortable. "Professor Wilson suggested I shouldn't. He said your funding situation is uncertain and I'd be better off joining his lab instead." Malcolm kept his expression neutral despite the sting. "I see. Well, my door is always open if you want to discuss further." After Tyler left, Malcolm stood alone in the empty classroom, his reflection faint in the dusty windows. He'd expected challenges at Westfield, but not this coordinated effort to undermine him. Later that week, Malcolm submitted a proposal for a promising graduate student symposium. The department had funding for 3 such events, and his topic, emerging algorithms in quantum computing, aligned perfectly with the university's strategic initiatives. 2 days later, he received a terse email from Dr. Harmon. "All symposium slots filled. Better luck next funding cycle." Curious, Malcolm checked the department calendar. Only one symposium was listed, Dr. Harmon's annual Classical Computing Paradigms event, the same one he'd run for the past decade. That evening, Malcolm bumped into Professor Chen in the parking lot. "Did you hear about the symposium selections?" Malcolm asked casually. Chen looked around nervously before answering. "It's weird. They held the committee meeting yesterday when half the voting members were at that conference in Boston. Never happened that way before." On his drive home, Malcolm turned up the music to drown out his thoughts. He thought about his students, who deserved better than to be crammed into inadequate classrooms because of departmental politics. He thought about the research he could accomplish if given a fair chance. At a red light, he noticed his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The car behind him honked when the light turned green. That night, Malcolm stayed up late, reviewing his careful documentation of every slight, every mishap, every closed-door meeting. He'd been keeping notes since day one, sensing that something wasn't right. The pattern was becoming clearer. This wasn't just unfriendliness or academic competition, it was systematic. And if he was going to change things, he needed more than just his own experiences as evidence. He needed data, and he needed a strategy. As the midnight hours ticked by, an idea began to form, one that would require patience, precision, and a completely different approach than his bullies might expect. Rain pounded against the windows of the science building as Malcolm hurried down the corridor. He'd stayed late, helping a group of struggling students understand a difficult concept. Their grateful smiles had brightened his otherwise frustrating day. When he reached the department office, most of the lights were off. Malcolm needed to check his mailbox before heading home. As he flipped through the usual flyers and memos, his hand froze on an envelope marked Grant Committee Decision. 3 months ago, he'd spent countless late nights working on a major research proposal with 2 other professors. The university had a chance at landing a prestigious $2 million grant for quantum computing research. Malcolm's contribution had been essential. The grant reviewers specifically mentioned his recent publications as a key factor in considering Westfield. With slightly trembling fingers, Malcolm opened the envelope. A single-page letter congratulated Professors Harmon and Wilson on securing the grant. Malcolm scanned the page twice, looking for his name. It wasn't there. "That can't be right," he whispered to the empty room. He pulled out his phone and checked the original proposal file he'd saved. There it was, his name listed as co-principal investigator, right alongside Harmon and Wilson. The next morning, Malcolm knocked on Dr. Harmon's door. "Come in," called Harmon, not looking up from his computer. "I received the grant notification yesterday," Malcolm said, keeping his voice even. "There seems to be a mistake. My name isn't listed as a co-investigator." Harmon finally glanced up, adjusting his glasses. Yes, the committee made some final adjustments. We needed more established researchers as principal investigators to strengthen our chances. University politics, you understand. But my research was central to the proposal. The reviewers specifically cited my work. "Look, Washington," Harmon said, leaning back in his chair, "you'll get other opportunities. Consider this a learning experience. You're still new here, you haven't earned your place yet." Malcolm felt heat rising in his face, but kept his expression neutral. "I see. Thank you for clarifying." As he turned to leave, Harmon added, "Oh, and the departmental meeting has been moved to 4 p.m. today. Try not to be late this time." Malcolm hadn't been late to a single meeting. That afternoon, Malcolm entered the faculty lounge to grab a cup of coffee before his next class. The conversation abruptly stopped. 3 professors who had been huddled around the bulletin board quickly dispersed. Curious, Malcolm approached the board. His stomach dropped. Someone had posted his student evaluations from midterm, and only his, none from the other professors. The most critical comments were circled in red marker, too rigid with deadlines. Lectures move too fast. Grading seems arbitrary. These were just 3 negative comments out of dozens of positive ones. Malcolm had received an overall rating well above the department average, but anyone looking at this display would never know it. Professor Chen appeared beside him, coffee cup in hand. "I'm sorry about this," he whispered. "I'll take it down." "No," Malcolm said quietly. "Let's leave it up. I'm not ashamed of honest feedback from my students." Rain was still falling when Malcolm finally left campus that evening. The parking lot was nearly empty, puddles reflecting the yellow streetlights. He fumbled for his keys, eager to get home and put this day behind him. When he reached his car, Malcolm stopped short. Someone had scratched a racial slur into the driver's side door, the crude letters unmistakable even in the dim light. For a long moment, he just stood there, rain soaking through his coat. Then he took out his phone and called campus security. 20 minutes later, an officer arrived, looking bored as he took notes. "Probably just students playing pranks," the officer said, barely examining the damage. "We'll file a report, but honestly, these things are hard to solve without witnesses." "This isn't a prank," Malcolm said firmly. "This is a hate crime." The officer shrugged. "Without evidence pointing to specific individuals, there's not much we can do. Maybe consider parking closer to the security cameras next time." That night, Malcolm sat at his kitchen table until 3 a.m., a cold cup of tea forgotten beside him. The scratch on his car could be repaired. The grant situation was frustrating, but not the end of the world. The student evaluations would be forgotten in a week. What couldn't be repaired so easily was the growing realization that the system itself was working against him. Traditional complaints and appeals would go nowhere. He'd be labeled as difficult, oversensitive, not a team player. Malcolm opened his laptop and began typing, his mind suddenly clear. If he was going to change things, he needed a different approach entirely. Something they wouldn't expect. Something that would force the entire university to face what was happening, not just to him, but to others as well. By the time the sun rose, Malcolm had the beginnings of a plan that would change everything. The weekend after the car incident, Malcolm didn't leave his apartment. The blinds stayed closed. Pizza boxes piled up on the coffee table. His phone buzzed with concerned messages from his family, but he couldn't find the words to explain what was happening. By Sunday evening, something shifted inside him. Malcolm Washington had never been a quitter. His grandmother's voice seemed to echo in his head. They can take away your comfort, but they can't take your dignity unless you hand it over. He showered, cleaned his apartment, and sat down at his desk with fresh determination. Filing a formal complaint would lead nowhere. He had seen how the system protected itself. He needed to try something completely different. If I'm going to fight this, he said to himself, I'll fight it my way, with data and truth. Monday morning, Malcolm arrived at campus earlier than usual. The administration building was quiet, just a few lights on. Perfect. He slipped into the records office where a sleepy student worker was sorting mail. Good morning, Malcolm said with a warm smile. I'm working on a department research project. Dean Powell authorized access to the faculty records. He showed the student worker his faculty ID and the project authorization form he'd created. It wasn't exactly a lie. He was doing research, just not the kind they might expect. Sure, Professor. The computer's over there. Just sign in, please. For the next 2 hours, Malcolm carefully collected information, hiring patterns, promotion rates, salary ranges, anonymized but sorted by gender and ethnicity, grant distributions, teaching assignments. Nothing confidential about individuals, just aggregate data that painted a clear picture. Over the next few weeks, Malcolm expanded his research. He gathered student demographic information, graduation rates across departments, and historical data about faculty retention. During his lunch breaks, he visited the alumni office, chatting with the friendly staff about the university's history while discreetly gathering more information. Late one evening, Malcolm ran into Professor Chen in the parking lot. You've been keeping to yourself lately, Chen observed. Everything okay? Malcolm hesitated, then made a decision. Can I buy you a coffee? I could use some perspective. At a quiet cafe off campus, Malcolm cautiously shared his experiences, the classroom reassignments, the grant removal, the vandalized car. Chen sighed. I wish I could say I'm surprised. When I first came here from Taiwan 15 years ago, let's just say some things haven't changed much. He stirred his coffee thoughtfully. You're not alone, you know. Professor Patel in engineering had similar experiences. And remember Dr. Rodriguez? Brilliant physicist, left after 2 years. Did they file complaints? Rodriguez did. The investigation found insufficient evidence of discriminatory intent. She's at Princeton now. This confirmed what Malcolm suspected. The problem wasn't just a few difficult colleagues. It was systematic. Back home, Malcolm organized his data using his background in analytics. The patterns were unmistakable. Minority faculty received less funding, taught more introductory courses, were promoted more slowly, and left the university at twice the rate of their white colleagues. Female professors faced similar disparities. Malcolm created graphs and charts, careful to anonymize all individual information. The numbers told a powerful story, one that couldn't be dismissed as personal grievance or oversensitivity. For 3 nights straight, he worked on transforming his findings into a formal research paper, Patterns of Implicit Bias in STEM Academia, a case study. He never named Westfield University, referring to it only as a mid-sized research university in the Northeast. The paper was rigorous, professional, and impossible to dismiss on methodological grounds. This wasn't an angry complaint, it was serious academic research about institutional patterns that could be measured, analyzed, and addressed. As dawn broke on the 4th day, Malcolm put the finishing touches on his manuscript. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, but for the first time in months, he felt a sense of purpose and control. This is how I fight back, he whispered to himself. Not with anger, but with excellence. He saved the document, made himself a strong cup of coffee, and began researching academic journals. He needed one with rigorous peer review, high impact factor, and a history of publishing work on institutional bias. The Journal of Higher Education Ethics seemed perfect. With a deep breath, Malcolm clicked Submit on the journal's website. His hands were steady. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time, he felt like he might actually win. 3 weeks after submitting his paper, Malcolm was grading exams in his office when his phone chimed with an email notification. He glanced at it, expecting another department memo, but froze when he saw the sender, Journal of Higher Education Ethics. His heart pounded as he opened the message. Dear Dr. Washington, we are pleased to inform you that your paper, Patterns of Implicit Bias in STEM Academia, a case study, has been accepted for publication. The reviewers found your methodology sound and your findings significant. Given the timely nature of your research, we would like to fast-track it for our next issue. Malcolm read the email 3 times, hardly believing it. Not only accepted but fast-tracked, a rare honor in academic publishing. One reviewer had called his work groundbreaking in its quantitative approach to measuring implicit bias. That night, Malcolm celebrated alone with a glass of his favorite whiskey, watching the sunset from his balcony. This was just the first step, but an important one. 2 months later, Malcolm stood at a podium in a crowded conference room at the National Conference on Higher Education. His presentation was scheduled for the last day, usually when attendance dwindled. But word had spread about his paper, and the room was packed. The data reveals that faculty from underrepresented groups are 68% less likely to receive internal research grants, Malcolm explained, pointing to a graph projected on the screen behind him. They are assigned 42% more introductory courses and 37% fewer advanced seminars, limiting their ability to work with graduate students. The audience was silent, absorbing the statistical evidence. Malcolm continued, showing chart after chart, explaining the patterns he had uncovered. This isn't about individual intent, he emphasized. These are systemic patterns that persist regardless of who sits on which committee. The question isn't who's to blame, it's how we measure and address these disparities. In the front row, a woman scribbled furiously in her notebook. The conference badge hanging around her neck identified her as a reporter from the Chronicle of Higher Education, one of the most influential publications in academia. During the Q&A session, hands shot up across the room. "Have you presented these findings to your administration?" someone asked. "Not yet," Malcolm replied. "I wanted to ensure the research was peer-reviewed and validated first." Another question came from a dean at a prestigious university. "How can other institutions apply your methodology to examine their own patterns?" Malcolm smiled. "That's exactly what I hoped people would ask. I've developed a framework that any university can use." After his presentation, a small crowd gathered around Malcolm. Fellow professors shared similar experiences. Department chairs asked about implementing his assessment tools. The reporter requested an interview. As Malcolm was packing up his materials, his phone buzzed with a text from Professor Chen. "Your paper is the talk of the department. Harmon is furious. Says you've betrayed confidentiality. Dean Powell defending you." Malcolm wasn't surprised. Though he'd been careful to anonymize his data, anyone familiar with Westfield would recognize the institution described in his paper. That evening, the reporter's interview with Malcolm went live on the Chronicle's website. By morning, it had been shared thousands of times. His inbox flooded with messages from faculty at universities across the country, many sharing their own experiences and data. 3 days later, Malcolm received an unexpected call from Dr. Powell. "The president wants to meet with you," she said, her voice tight. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. "May I ask what this is about?" Malcolm asked, though he already knew. "Your paper has caught the attention of some major donors. They're asking questions the president doesn't have answers to." "I see," Malcolm replied calmly. "I'll be there." After hanging up, Malcolm straightened his tie and looked at his reflection in the office window. He had known this confrontation was coming. He didn't feel nervous or afraid, just ready. This was never about revenge or humiliating anyone. It was about transforming a system that hurt not just him, but countless others who lacked the platform to speak out. His strategy was working exactly as planned. Tomorrow would bring the next phase, facing the university leadership with truth backed by irrefutable data. Malcolm smiled slightly at his reflection. They had expected him to either stay quiet or lash out. They never expected him to change the entire conversation. The president's office was fancier than any room Malcolm had seen at Westfield. Leather chairs, oak bookshelves, and large windows overlooking the campus. President Thompson sat behind an enormous desk, flanked by the university's legal counsel and the head of public relations. Dr. Harmon was there too, his face tight with barely controlled anger. "Dr. Washington," President Thompson began, "we've asked you here to discuss your research paper." Malcolm nodded, calm and professional. "I'd be happy to walk you through my methodology." "That won't be necessary," the president said sharply. "What we'd like to understand is why you felt the need to publish potentially damaging information about this institution without bringing your concerns to us first." Malcolm took a measured breath. "With all due respect, sir, my paper doesn't name Westfield. It describes patterns observed at a mid-sized research university in the Northeast." "Don't play games," Dr. Harmon snapped. "Anyone in academia can figure out which university you're describing." "The paper passed peer review," Malcolm replied evenly. "The data speaks for itself." The lawyer leaned forward. "Dr. Washington, there could be legal implications if this paper damages the university's reputation." Malcolm had anticipated this. From his briefcase, he removed a folder containing copies of every incident he documented: the classroom reassignments, the grant removal, the vandalized car, everything with dates and details. "I understand your concern," he said, sliding the folder across the desk. "I've been documenting my experiences here for months. If we're discussing legal implications, perhaps we should start with these incidents." The president opened the folder, his expression hardening as he flipped through the pages. The PR director peeked over his shoulder, her face paling. "You never filed formal complaints about these incidents," the president noted. "Would they have made a difference?" Malcolm asked quietly. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. 3 days later, Malcolm was surprised to receive an email announcing that the Board of Trustees had commissioned an external review of the university's hiring, promotion, and resource allocation practices. The review would be conducted by an independent consulting firm specializing in higher education equity. "They're covering themselves," Professor Chen told Malcolm over lunch. "3 major donors threatened to pull funding after reading about your research. One sits on the board and has a daughter who experienced similar problems in the physics department." Word spread quickly. Other faculty members began sharing their own stories. Professor Patel from engineering revealed that she'd been passed over for promotion 3 times despite having twice the publications of her male colleagues. A group of international faculty described how they were consistently excluded from important committees. 2 weeks into the external review, Dr. Harmon was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Several of his closest allies suddenly became scarce around campus. The review team interviewed Malcolm for over 4 hours, asking detailed questions about his research methodology and findings. They seemed genuinely impressed by the rigor of his work. "Your approach is remarkable," the lead investigator told him. "Instead of making it personal, you've created a framework for measuring bias that can be applied across institutions." By the 6th week, the president's tone had changed completely. In a university-wide email, he announced the preliminary findings of the external review, which had confirmed most of Malcolm's conclusions. "Westfield is committed to addressing these systemic issues," the email stated. "We thank Dr. Washington for bringing these matters to light through his scholarly research." The same afternoon, Malcolm received another email, this one from the president's office, requesting a private meeting. Curious, he accepted. This time, only President Thompson was in the office. Gone was the defensive administrator from their first meeting. He looked tired, humbled. "Dr. Washington," he began, "the board and I have been discussing ways to address the problems identified in the review." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "We'd like to offer you a new position." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "What kind of position?" "We're establishing a center for academic equity with substantial funding and a mandate to implement real change across the university. We'd like you to lead it." Malcolm sat back stunned. This was far more than he had expected. "I'll need complete autonomy," he said after a moment, "and resources to build a proper team." The president nodded. "Whatever you need. The board is fully committed." He hesitated. "You've changed this institution, Dr. Washington, not through complaints or lawsuits, but through excellence." As Malcolm left the president's office, he felt a strange mix of emotions. This wasn't victory. It was something more important. It was the beginning of real change. 3 years passed quickly. On a bright spring morning, Malcolm stood at the window of his new office, watching students crossing the main quad. His office was now on the top floor of the renovated Wilson Hall, renamed Unity Hall last year after the board discovered Professor Wilson's history of discriminatory practices. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Professor Chen entered, carrying a stack of papers. "The final numbers for this year," Chen said, sliding the report onto Malcolm's desk. "I thought you'd want to see them before the anniversary celebration tomorrow." Malcolm smiled. "Thanks. How do they look?" "Better than we hoped. Faculty diversity up 34% since you started the center. Retention rates for minority professors improved by 41%. Research funding distribution now shows no significant disparity across demographic groups." Malcolm nodded, genuinely proud. The Center for Academic Equity had started small, just him and 2 part-time staff, but now employed 12 people and had become a model for universities nationwide. 5 other institutions had already implemented similar programs based on his framework. "And the computer science department?" Malcolm asked. Chen grinned. "The most diverse faculty in its history, and climbing 3 spots in the national rankings since Dr. Powell took over as chair. After Dr. Harmon's resignation, Dean Powell had stepped in as department chair, bringing a fresh approach that emphasized collaboration over competition. The change in atmosphere was remarkable." The next evening, hundreds gathered in the university's Grand Hall for the 75th anniversary celebration of the Science and Technology Division. Malcolm sat at the head table alongside President Thompson and several board members. As the dinner plates were cleared away, President Thompson approached the podium. "Tonight we celebrate not just our past, but the transformation of Westfield over these last 3 years," he began. "When I became president 15 years ago, I had a vision of excellence for this university. What I failed to understand was that true excellence cannot exist without equity and inclusion." The president's gaze found Malcolm in the crowd. "It took the courage and brilliance of one professor to show us what we couldn't or wouldn't see for ourselves. Through rigorous scholarship rather than accusation, Dr. Washington held up a mirror that forced us to confront uncomfortable truths." Malcolm listened, remembering those dark early days, the isolation, the vandalized car, the countless small humiliations. He thought about how close he'd come to giving up, to seeking a position elsewhere. After dinner, Malcolm slipped away from the crowd for a moment of quiet. In the hallway, he found himself looking at the Wall of Transformation, a display showing the changes at Westfield over time. His own paper was framed there, alongside news articles about the center and data visualizations showing the university's progress. "Quite something, isn't it?" came a voice behind him. Malcolm turned to see an elderly man he didn't recognize. "I'm Thomas Brown," the man said, extending his hand. "Class of '68. First black student to graduate from Westfield's physics program." He nodded toward the display. "What you've done here." "I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime." "I just showed them the data," Malcolm said modestly. The older man chuckled. "No, son, you did much more than that. You found a way to change the system from within, using their own language and values. That takes a special kind of wisdom." Later that night, as Malcolm drove home, he reflected on how differently things had turned out than he'd expected. When he'd submitted that paper, he'd simply hoped to document the problems, maybe force some accountability. He never imagined he'd be leading institutional change, or that Westfield would become known nationally for its equity initiatives. The professors who had once tried to bully him now found themselves marginalized by their own behavior. Several had left the university. Others had adapted, some even becoming supporters of the new approach. As he pulled into his driveway, Malcolm's phone buzzed with a text from his brother, saw the university's post about the celebration. "Mom's telling everyone her son fixed a whole university. So proud of you." Malcolm smiled. He hadn't fixed Westfield alone. It had taken hundreds of people embracing change, from students to the board of trustees. But he had shown them a path forward, using the very tools of academia that others had tried to deny him. He had transformed discrimination into data and data into lasting change.